Sam, I want to ask you about your views, what you've seen in schools, in remote communities, that tells you something about accountability and its significance in the running of schools and in the morale of teaching staff, in the way that they do their teaching.
I think it's important to remember, with all of the frustrations and all this sort of dialogue about failure and schools not being up to scratch, that essentially educators, and particularly people who would leave their home in the city, leave their family and go out bush to teach, in the main are doing that for reasons because they really care, and they want to do a good job. They want to do a good job by the community, and that's often a decision point that brings them to the remote community. Once you arrive, I think particularly principals, but educators as well, seem to be caught in the middle of these demands, and so there's these system demands and accountability demands there, and then there's these demands at another point, which is the local school and peers, and then there's the community. I think particularly for remote principals who have impossibly busy lives, they inevitably end up needing to triage the demands and the level of need in order to survive. So it almost becomes managing from crisis to crisis. And so when it comes to accountability, many teachers would feel, in a very altruistic sense, that need to listen to the community and want to do the right thing and be accountable to the community. But that is the first kind of audience of accountability that drops off. The day-to-day busyness of being in a school takes over. And I think the grey cloud that scares everybody, that ultimately wins the day as the strong hand in the debate, is the system. Whether that's because of the threat of or the risk of publicity or bad press about failure or something that's gone wrong, or occasionally, the words external review come up and bring tremors of fear through middle management and local school principals and the teachers, and there's this kind of worry about what that might bring out. And so a lot of your task as a remote educator is ticking boxes to make sure that you're minimising risk, so that in terms of that accountability, that actually has a very, very large voice. So documenting the things that you do, almost in a case management sense, to minimise risk around student well-being. Although because of our altruistic nature, we would also say we care for young people and their well-being and their lives, but ultimately we need to make sure that the paperwork shows that we went through the processes that ensured that a service was delivered that could be reasonably expected to minimise harm to the young person.
I want to ask you though, well, what's the way to fix that? What's the how do you deal with that with the system?
That's a very interesting question, John.
What should the system do in order to allow teachers to teach and principals to lead without, are you suggesting that all of those accountability sticks and tick the boxes type of exercises are a waste of time, or how should the system respond for remote educators?
In a way, I think if you take the APY lands, for example, and you think back to Ernabella mission time, which was obviously a fairly known entity of the way things were and who was going to look after what on a day-to-day basis, and then the mission gave control to the state, and so the state began to develop infrastructure and that external accountability in an increasing fashion, but it's almost like there was a period in between, and it almost reminds me of the C.S. Lewis Narnia series, where Aslan sort of goes around and speaks all these things into life with these great ideas. It seemed to be a very imaginative and creative period, and it seemed in Alice Springs we jokingly call some of these people the Spinifex Mafia, but they tend to be people, I think, who were young people in that very creative and dynamic period where there was little infrastructure and probably very little accountability back to the state, because those mechanisms hadn't really been fully developed yet. And in many senses, there was this lingering memory of the community doing pretty much everything for themselves under some sense of guidance. And
that's all good.
Yeah.
But what what practically now? You sort of hark back to the golden days of the Silver Bullet Caravan,
Yeah.
and those innovative educators. I mean, you can argue that they weren't any more successful than the ones that have had all the training today. But how should the system respond today to the needs to be creative, the need to be, but at the same time balance out that accountability stuff?
Well, I think I guess where I was going with that story was that as infrastructures increased and investment into infrastructure and the development of communities increased, so too did the expectation of accountability back to the system. And as more data, was sort of flowing back and showed, we need more help, we need more help, we need more help. Well, we keep getting more help, but it's always externally imagined, and it's externally centred in terms of who gets to decide what's important and how they're going to go about it, and ultimately who makes the call as to whether it's successful or not. And so I guess I would be arguing that we've actually gone too far along the continuum to accountability and imagining about what needs to happen. So I would be arguing that we need to focus more on the local context about developing accountability back to the community, and the community needs to be more involved. I believe you have to start with involving community in a discussion and informing community, and then expecting the community to actually take their role seriously and in a more professional way. I think when you have low or no expectation of the community's capacity to comprehend what's happening in schools and what might be considered to be successful or improvement or important, I think the community is quite happy to reciprocate those expectations. And so I guess I'd be hoping that principals and middle management and bureaucrats would place more expectation on community, but also alongside of that, giving better information, more resources, more control, and more space for, I suppose, that creativity and imagining, but also to provide accountability back to the community as well.
Okay, great.